There's something nobody tells you about soldiers who have seen the worst of it. They don't come back loud. They don't come back shaking, not in the way you'd expect, not in the way the films show you, with trembling hands and wild eyes at every sound. No, the ones who have truly been through it, the ones who have stood in the mud at Passchendaele and watched the man beside them simply cease to exist, those men come back *quiet*, dangerously, achingly quiet. And in the winter of 1917, London was full of that particular silence. It was a Tuesday morning in late November when Sergeant Edmund Harwell first noticed it. He was standing at the iron gate of St. James's Palace, not Buckingham, mind you, St. James's, the older one, the one tourists walked past without quite understanding why it mattered. And he was watching a sparrow pick at a crust of bread someone had dropped on the pavement. That's how bored he was, watching a sparrow. A man who 6 weeks prior had been crawling through a communications trench under artillery fire, and now he was watching a sparrow. He didn't move, couldn't, that was the job. The bearskin hat sat heavy on his head, always did in the cold, heavier than people assumed, heavier than it looked in the photographs tourists sent home. The scarlet tunic was stiff in the November chill, the fabric holding the cold like a second skin, and Harwell could feel the damp seeping into his boots from the flagstones. His rifle, a Lee Enfield, same as the ones they used out there, rested against his shoulder at the precise angle it was supposed to rest. Not 1 degree off. Not one. That was the thing about the ceremonial posting. Everything had to be exactly right, exactly perfect, which was almost funny if you thought about it long enough. Out there, nothing was ever exactly anything. Everything was chaos and noise and the smell of burned earth and things you couldn't name. Here, everything had to look like a painting. A still, perfect, untouched painting. Harwell had been selected for the posting temporarily, they said, just for the season while the battalion rested and refitted because of his bearing. That's what Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth had told him. You carry yourself well, Harwell. You'll represent the regiment properly. Which was a polite army way of saying, you don't flinch. Which was a polite human way of saying, you've learned to feel nothing on the outside. He was 26 years old, and he felt approximately 60. The battalion, officially the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, had rotated back from the Ypres salient in October, 43 days at the front. Before that, a 7-week stint in the summer, and before that, the terrible autumn of 1916 on the Somme, which nobody talked about now. You didn't talk about the Somme. Not in any billet, not over any tin of cold tea, not in any letter home. The Somme was something that happened inside you, and it stayed there, and that was that. 41 men from Harwell's company had gone in. 23 came out walking. The rest were either gone entirely or somewhere in a casualty clearing station with pieces of themselves missing. And then 6 weeks later, here they were, outside a palace in red coats, watching tourists. That was the arrangement. It had been the arrangement for over 2 centuries, and the war hadn't entirely changed it, because some things about England simply could not be changed without England ceasing to be England. The household division provided ceremonial duties even during wartime. Not all of them, not all the time, but enough. Enough to show the public that the institution continued. Enough to reassure Londoners, who were already living under the possibility of Zeppelin raids and the daily horror of the casualty lists posted outside newspaper offices, that something permanent still existed in their city. Something that stood its ground. The men selected weren't grateful for it, not exactly, but they weren't ungrateful either. Private Thomas Jedge, posted beside Harwell at the secondary gate, had put it best during their first week back, while they were polishing their boots in the guardroom by lamplight. It's strange, Jedge had said, working at a stubborn scuff mark near the toe. Standing out there all day with nothing happening. I keep listening for something. Can't stop listening. Harwell had understood exactly what he meant. Your body didn't unknow what it had learned. Your ears didn't stop scanning for the particular whistle of incoming shell fire just because you were now standing outside a palace in London with tourists taking photographs. What do you do about it? Harwell had asked. Jedge had looked up from his boot, young face, 20 years old, maybe 21, eyes that looked older. "I watch the pigeons," he said. "If the pigeons are calm, nothing's happening." Harwell had almost smiled at that. Almost. London in November 1917 was not the London of picture postcards. The city existed in a kind of suspended anxiety, not quite panic, not quite peace, but something trembling in between. The shop windows on Pall Mall had reduced displays, some boarded where glass had been replaced with wood after a raid scare. The women in the streets wore darker colors than before the war, not mourning clothes exactly, but darker, quieter. Men of fighting age on the street were either in uniform or walking with canes, or wearing the particular expression of men who felt the need to silently explain themselves to strangers. The buses still ran. The flower sellers were still at their corners on the Strand. Children still chased pigeons in Trafalgar Square, which was, Harwell supposed, either a sign of human resilience or human stubbornness. He hadn't decided which. The tourists still came to see the guards too, fewer of them than before the war, obviously. The American visitors had largely stopped coming. America was only just in the war, still mobilizing, not yet sending men to the front in numbers, and the continental Europeans were obviously not present. But there were still the home visitors. Families from Manchester and Birmingham and Edinburgh, come down to London for reasons of business or medicine or bureaucracy, who found themselves standing on the pavement outside St. James's or the Horse Guards with their children. The children were the hardest part. Not because they misbehaved, though some did, the brave ones who tried to make the guard laugh or move, who held up sweets or pulled faces or danced in the guard's peripheral vision. That was manageable. You learned to see them without seeing them, to be aware of movement without responding to it. No, the hard part was simpler than that. The hard part was that the children looked at you like you were something magnificent. A small girl, 4 years old, maybe 5, had stood in front of Harwell on his third day of posting. She was wearing a blue wool coat with brown buttons, and her hair was in 2 plaits, and she stared up at him the way children stare at very large and very still things, with complete, undivided awe, as if he were a statue that might suddenly breathe. Her mother was trying to get her to move along. "He's a soldier, sweetheart. He can't talk to you." The girl hadn't moved. "Is he a real soldier?" she asked her mother, though she was still looking directly at Harwell. "Yes, of course." "Has he been to the war?" A pause. "I don't know, love, probably." The girl considered this for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She gave a small, serious nod as if she'd made a decision, and very carefully, with great deliberateness, she curtsied. The way you'd curtsy for royalty. Then her mother took her hand and led her away. Harwell stood completely still. He would stand completely still for another 4 hours before his relief came. He stood with the memory of that curtsy sitting somewhere in his chest like a warm stone, and he thought, without letting it reach his face, without letting it become anything visible, that it was possibly the strangest and most unexpected honor anyone had ever paid him. More unexpected than the medals, certainly. The guardroom itself was a world apart from the post outside. When you came off duty, after the 2 hours, or the 4 hours depending on the rotation, you came inside to warmth and familiar chaos and the specific smell of military accommodation, boot polish and damp wool, and the faint underlayer of cigarette smoke that never quite left military buildings regardless of what you did. There were benches along the walls and a stove in the corner that someone was always either feeding or complaining about, and a table where men sat with mugs of tea and said very little. They said very little, these men, which was notable because soldiers were generally not a quiet group, in billets behind the front. There was noise constantly, card games and arguments and songs, and the particular elaborate obscenity that soldiers use to fill silence the way other people use weather as conversation. But these men in this guardroom were quieter than that. They'd been through something that had changed the frequency of their noise. Lance Corporal Arthur Fenwick was the exception, slightly. Fenwick talked. Not constantly, not nervously, but regularly enough that the others had come to rely on it, on his commentary, his observations about the tourists and the passers-by, and the odd incidents that made up the texture of the posting. He was from Staffordshire, broad-shouldered, with a manner that suggested he found human beings fundamentally interesting and slightly ridiculous, which was a useful attitude for a man doing ceremonial guard duty. "There was a man today," he said one afternoon, unlacing his boots, "stood in front of me for 20 full minutes trying to get me to blink." "Did you?" someone asked from near the stove. "Did I what?" "Blink." "Of course I blinked. I'm not a bloody fish. But I didn't blink at him asterisk, which is different." Harwell listened to this from his bench, cleaning his already clean rifle, the way he cleaned it every evening regardless of whether it needed it. The rhythm was comforting. Pull through, check, reassemble. Pull through, check, reassemble. "My sister wrote," asterisk said Private Jedge from the far corner. He didn't look up from his letter. "She says there's a family in their street whose son was at Passchendaele and hasn't spoken since he came back. Just sits in the front room, doesn't speak." Nobody said anything for a moment. "Which street?" Fenwick asked. "What? Which street does your sister live on?" "Fenwick, what does that matter?" "Just wondering if I know them." "You're from Staffordshire?" "Yes, and—" Jedge looked up, and despite everything, despite the letter, despite the story in it, something crossed his face that was almost a smile. "You don't know them, Fenwick." "I might." "You don't." "Fair enough." And that was how they managed it. Not by talking about the thing directly. Not by sitting down together and examining the weight of what they'd seen and done and survived. But by talking around it, beside it, past it, by filling the air with small absurdities until the heavy thing became slightly more bearable by contrast. The ceremony itself, the changing of the guard, was performed with a precision that still struck Harwell as almost supernatural given the men performing it. He'd been through it a dozen times now, as participant and as observer, and it still caught him off guard, not the ceremony itself, which he knew by heart, but the moment when it began, when the detachment marched out into the courtyard and the music started and something happened to the men. Something in their bodies changed. The slump of exhaustion became straightness. The 1,000-yard look became focus. Whatever was happening inside, and Harwell knew what was happening inside, had felt it himself, went somewhere else for the duration. They became, in those minutes, exactly what the public needed them to be. He'd thought about that a lot in his quiet hours on the post, about the performance of it. Not performance in the dishonest sense, there was nothing dishonest about it, but the idea that a soldier could contain two entirely separate realities in himself simultaneously. The reality of what he'd seen and done and what it had cost him, and the reality of what he was showing the world. Steadiness, continuity, the suggestion that the nation's structures were intact and unbroken. They were the same men, both things were true at once. That seemed important, though Harwell couldn't have said exactly why. It was near the end of the 3rd week of the posting, when the incident happened. Not the main incident that came later in a different form, which you'll hear about shortly. This was a smaller thing, but it matters for what came after, so stay with it. It was a Thursday afternoon, gray sky, thin crowd, the kind of London day where the city feels old and a little tired. Harwell was on the outer post, near the railings facing the public pavement. There was a small group of visitors, a woman of about 50, a younger woman who was probably her daughter, and between them a young man of perhaps 20 using a crutch. His left trouser leg was pinned up near the knee. They stood for a while, watching. The young man was watching Harwell specifically, with an expression that was complicated. There was something in it that Harwell recognized without being able to name it cleanly. After a few minutes, the older woman turned to go. The younger woman took the young man's arm gently. But the young man paused, and then quietly, so quietly that Harwell wasn't entirely certain he'd heard it correctly, the young man said, "Ypres, second time around, you." He wasn't speaking loudly. He wasn't performing for the crowd. He was just asking, one soldier to another, speaking in a language that didn't require an answer. Harwell could not answer, could not break position, could not acknowledge the question, could not give the young man what he was perhaps looking for, whatever that was. Recognition, maybe. The simple acknowledgement that they occupied a shared world that most of the people on this pavement did not. So Harwell did nothing, stood exactly as he was supposed to stand. But as the young man turned and the family walked away, Harwell let his eyes, just his eyes, not his head, not his posture, not a single muscle in his face, follow them for 3 seconds. 3 seconds, that was all he could give. He hoped it was enough. He suspected the young man knew exactly what it meant. The posting lasted 6 weeks before orders came through for redeployment. 6 weeks of flagstones and bearskin hats and sparrows and tourists, and cold tea in the guardroom and Fenwick's running commentary and Jedge's letters from his sister, and the rifle he cleaned every night whether it needed it or not. On the last evening, Harwell sat on the bench in the guardroom for a while after the others had gone to sleep. The stove was low. Outside, London was quiet in the particular way it got after midnight, not silent, never silent, always something moving somewhere, some cart or motor vehicle or distant voice, but quieter. He thought about the little girl in the blue coat. He thought about the young man with the crutch. He thought about what it meant to stand still in a chaotic world and simply be there, to be a visible, fixed point while everything moved around you. He wasn't sure it was heroism. He wasn't sure it was anything as grand as that. But he thought it might be something. He didn't know yet what the next tour would bring. He'd find out soon enough. For now, he was just a man sitting by a dying stove in London, thinking about a sparrow and a curtsy, and 3 seconds of eye contact that had said everything and nothing. Outside, somewhere past the darkened city, the war continued. It always continued. He'd be back in it soon enough. Part 2, the day the earth shook on them all. You want to know what it sounds like when a bomb goes off near Hyde Park Corner. It doesn't sound like the films, not the deep asterisk boom of the cinema. It's more immediate than that, more physical. It hits you before you hear it, a pressure in the chest, a sudden wrongness in the air, and then the sound arrives about half a second later like something enormous clearing its throat. And then the silence after. The silence after is the worst part. It was the 14th of July, 1918. A Saturday. That detail matters, because Saturdays brought more people out, more families, more children, more ordinary civilians who'd taken a bus to central London, because even in wartime, even with the rationing and the casualty lists, and the low gray mood that had settled over the city like weather, people still needed to move through the world, still needed to do something with a Saturday. The mall was busy. Not festival busy, not pre-war busy, but enough people to fill the wide avenue with something like normal life. Women with perambulators, a group of nurses in their gray uniforms walking in a pair, older gentlemen in dark suits who'd come out of their clubs for air, a handful of American soldiers, you saw more of them now, the Yanks in their different cut uniforms, still slightly uncertain looking in the way newcomers to a war always look. A photographer with a large camera on a tripod, trying to get a clean shot of Buckingham Palace through the trees. At the guard post on the eastern approach to the palace, a secondary position, not the main ceremonial gate, Private William Oakes was into the 53rd minute of his 2-hour stint. Oakes was 19. He'd been at Arras in the spring. He didn't talk about Arras. He was tall, Oakes, tall enough that the bearskin hat made him appear almost comically large from a distance, which was probably part of the intention if you thought about it. The full ceremonial dress added a kind of scale to a man, made him into a symbol as much as a person. That was deliberate. That had always been deliberate. He was watching, not watching, asterisk, not watching, asterisk. That was the discipline. You kept the gaze fixed and forward. You didn't watch the photographer fussing with his equipment when it happened. The pressure first, then the sound. Then, from the direction of Hyde Park Corner, a column of gray-brown smoke beginning to rise. The sound hit the mall like a physical thing. People stopped. That's the first reaction, always the stopping, before the mind catches up with what the body has registered. A moment of absolute collective stillness. Then the noise came back differently. A woman's voice, high and sharp. A child crying, though Oakes couldn't see where, just the sound reaching him through the suddenly complicated air. The photographer had knocked over his tripod and was struggling with it, which was an absurd detail that Oakes' mind registered and stored beside everything else. The American soldiers had shifted posture, all three of them simultaneously, into something that was recognizably military alertness. The smoke was real. It was continuing to rise. There was something going on at Hyde Park Corner, or near it, and the people on the mall were beginning to understand this, and understanding it was beginning to change the atmosphere from confusion to something sharper. Someone ran past Oakes' position, a man in a dark suit, running asterisk toward asterisk the smoke, which meant he was either very brave or a reporter or both. Oakes did not move. This is the part that people who weren't there sometimes struggle to understand. The idea that a young man, 19 years old, a veteran of Eris, standing in ceremonial dress with a crowd beginning to panic around him, simply didn't move. That he remained precisely where he was, at precisely the angle he was supposed to maintain, facing precisely the direction the post required. It wasn't numbness. It wasn't stupidity. It wasn't even particularly dramatic courage, not in the way courage is usually described. It was training, yes, but it was also something else. It was the understanding, bone deep, certain as anything Oakes had ever been certain of, that his moving would make things worse, that his post existed for a reason, that the reason didn't disappear because something frightening was happening nearby, that if anything, the reason became more important. He could feel his heartbeat. He wasn't made of stone. He could feel the cold sweat starting under the stiff collar of the tunic. His hands on the rifle were not entirely steady in their internal tension, though from the outside, if anyone was looking at him at that precise moment, they would have appeared perfectly still. The crowd on the mall was beginning to fragment. Some people moved toward the palace gates, toward him, toward the building behind him, because the instinct when frightened is to move toward something solid, something that looks like it's meant to be there. He saw this happening in his peripheral vision. People drifting closer to the railings, to the gates, to the permanent and immovable things. A woman with a perambulator stopped perhaps 15 feet from his position. She was trying to decide which direction to go. You could see it in her body, the pivot and hesitation, the turn toward the smoke and then away from it. She had a small child in the perambulator, wrapped in something white, and a second child, older, maybe 5 or 6, holding onto the side with one hand. The older child, a boy, was looking at Oakes. Not at the smoke, not at the direction the adults were looking, at Oakes. The boy's face was not panicked. It was questioning. It was the face of someone gathering information from the available sources, and one of the available sources was this tall, red-coated figure who was not moving, who showed no sign of moving, who stood with the particular stillness of something that had decided where it was going to be. Oakes couldn't see the boy's face clearly, not directly, not while keeping his gaze where it was supposed to be. But he could see the shape of the boy in his peripheral vision, and the shape of the boy was calm, or becoming calmer. The woman with the perambulator stopped pivoting. She settled slightly, moved the perambulator slightly closer to the railings and stayed there, in the shelter of the near certainty that whatever was happening, This particular spot had a guard on it. Oakes held his position. The smoke over Hyde Park Corner was thickening. Police whistles, now, the sharp, repeated sound that meant organization was beginning to arrive. Motor vehicles distantly. The city's emergency mechanisms waking up, which took time and was sometimes slower than fear expected but always, eventually, arrived. There was a moment, maybe 20 minutes after the blast, maybe less. Time moved strangely in circumstances like this, when a man approached Oakes' position directly. Not a tourist, not a passerby. A man in civilian clothes who walked with the kind of deliberateness that suggested he was trying very hard to appear more composed than he felt. Middle-aged, heavyset, wearing a hat that had been knocked slightly off angle and hadn't been straightened. His hands were shaking faintly. He walked up to within perhaps 6 feet of Oakes' position and said, not unkindly, "Son, there's been a bomb. Don't you think you ought to?" He gestured vaguely, perhaps at the smoke, perhaps at some idea of safety that he couldn't quite locate in the confused geography of the moment. Oakes didn't respond, couldn't respond, but he held the man's gaze, which was a very slight departure from strict form but human, and possibly what the man needed for just a moment. Just long enough for the man to see what was in Oakes' face. Which was, I know there's been a bomb, I am staying here. This is where I am supposed to be. This is where I am going to stay. The man looked at him for a long moment. Then something in the man's face changed. The frantic quality faded slightly. His hands were still shaking, but the wild-eyed cast of near panic softened. He straightened his hat. "Right," he said, "right." And he moved away, but more slowly, more steadily than he'd arrived. The sergeant of the guard, Sergeant Patrick Doyle, 28, Thiepval veteran, man of very few words and large opinions about the correct way to polish brass, arrived at the post approximately 30 minutes after the blast. He looked at Oakes. He looked at the crowd, which had settled into a kind of anxious watchfulness rather than the sharper, more dangerous kind of panic it might have become. He looked back at Oakes. "How long have you been standing there?" 1 hour and 23 minutes, Sergeant." "And you didn't move?" It wasn't quite a question. "No, Sergeant." Doyle was quiet for a moment. He pulled out his pocket watch, checked it, put it away, looked at the smoke still visible over the trees toward Hyde Park. "IRA, they think. Constabulary's dealing with it." "Yes, Sergeant." "No casualties reported near here." "I'm glad of that, Sergeant." Doyle looked at him again. There was something in the sergeant's expression that was not quite approval. Approval was too warm a word for Doyle, generally, but it was in the same family as approval. "Right," he said. 7 more minutes and your relief comes. Don't move until then." "No, Sergeant." Doyle turned and walked back toward the guardroom. Oakes stood for 7 more minutes. The boy who'd been holding onto the perambulator had gone with his mother by now, moved along the mall to wherever they'd been going before all of this. But the stillness that the child had gathered from watching Oakes remained somewhere in the atmosphere of the afternoon, in the way the crowd on the mall had not entirely dissolved, in the way some of them had stayed, held in place by the same logic the child had used. If that doesn't move, there must be a reason. There was a reason. There had always been a reason. In the guardroom afterward, Oakes didn't tell the story himself. Stories like that, in rooms like this, had a way of being told around the person they concerned, through other people who'd heard from someone who'd seen, through Fenwick types who had the talent for making the unremarkable remarkable through sheer commitment to it. Oakes sat on a bench and drank his tea, and took off his boots with the particular care of a man whose feet were extremely tired. Private Jedge, who'd been on duty near the main gate, had heard the blast too. They'd all heard it. When Jedge came off his own relief and found Oakes in the guardroom, he sat down beside him and said nothing for a while, which was the appropriate thing to say. "Then were you frightened?" Oakes considered this genuinely. It deserved a genuine answer. My hands were, he said finally. The rest of me was mostly thinking about my feet. Jedge nodded as if this made complete sense. The pigeons went, Jedge said. All of them at once. I've never seen so many pigeons go at once. Did they come back? Eventually, takes them a while. Oakes wrapped both hands around his mug. The tea was too hot, but he held it anyway, for the warmth through the ceramic. They always come back, he said, not about the pigeons specifically, about something larger that used the pigeons as its shape. Jedge understood. Yeah, he said, they do. The stove in the corner crackled. Someone dropped something in the next room. Somewhere on the mall, a motor car horn sounded, and then another, and gradually the sounds of London reassembled themselves into something that was almost ordinary. The city found its way back to itself. It always did. And the men who'd held their posts while it shook, they'd helped it get there. Part 3, the last march home. Nobody tells you about the ending. The beginning of a war everyone talks about. The recruitment posters and the speeches and the crowds cheering at the railway stations. The middle of a war, well, that's what the newspapers are for, and the letters home, and the things people don't say at dinner that say everything. But the ending, the actual physical, temporal moment when the thing stops, nobody quite prepares you for that. Because it doesn't feel like what you expected. It doesn't feel like winning. The 11th of November, 1918, Armistice Day. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns had stopped. Not gradually, not winding down like a machine slowing, one cylinder at a time, all at once. After 4 years and 3 months of noise so constant that men had stopped hearing it and started feeling it as a permanent condition of existence, the guns simply stopped, and the silence that followed was, according to every man who experienced it, the most disorienting, unexpected, overwhelming thing they had ever encountered. In London, the silence lasted approximately 45 seconds before it was replaced by something else entirely. By noon, the streets were full. Corporal James Whitmore heard the noise before he saw it. He was in the guardroom at Buckingham Palace, the main palace now, not the secondary posts, and the guardroom was on the inner side of things, the side that looked into the palace forecourt rather than outward toward the city. So the noise reached him before the sight did, a sound rising from beyond the gates, from the mall and the surrounding streets, that was unlike anything he'd heard before. It wasn't cheering exactly, or not only cheering, it was bigger than cheering. It was the sound of 200,000 people simultaneously experiencing the same thing, and the same thing was relief so profound it had become audible. Whitmore was 23. He'd done 2 tours, one in 16, one in 17, and had been on the ceremonial posting since August, which meant he'd missed the last great push of the war, missed the 100 days that brought it finally, agonizingly to its end. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. There was guilt in it. There was also, if he was honest with himself, the thing underneath the guilt that he wasn't going to name. He went to the window. Through the glass, and through the gates he could see the crowd beginning to gather on the mall, and it was growing, visibly growing from minute to minute, as if London itself were a living thing exhaling after 4 years of held breath. "Corporal!" He turned. Sergeant Harwell, the same Harwell from St. James's, moved to this posting 2 months back, was standing in the doorway with an expression that was controlled in the way Harwell's expressions were always controlled, which was to say with visible effort. "We're going out," Harwell said. "Full ceremony, orders just came down. Today now, the king's going to appear, the battalion will form up in the forecourt." He paused, the whole thing. Whitmore looked at him, then at the window, then back. "Right," he said, "right, I need to get my right." The forming up took time. Everything proper took time. The uniforms had to be exactly right, which on a day like this, a day of enormous, almost incomprehensible meaning, felt simultaneously absurd and absolutely necessary. Private Jedge's buttons were not acceptable to Sergeant Doyle, and 3 minutes were spent on Jedge's buttons while outside the crowd continued to swell. Fenwick had lost one of his gloves and was not permitted to appear without it, and the lost glove was eventually found under a bench in the anteroom. These were the small, ridiculous human details of a historic day. Whitmore did not find them ridiculous. He found them without quite having the vocabulary for it at the time, though he'd think about it later, many times in the decades that followed necessary. As if the particularity of it, the specificity, the insistence that the buttons be right and the gloves be present and the angle of the rifle be correct down to the last degree, was itself a kind of argument. An argument that things still mattered, that form still mattered, that the shape of things was worth preserving. They'd spent 4 years in a place where form had been destroyed utterly, where the landscape itself had been reduced to something formless and lunar, where the structure of days and the structure of bodies had both been broken. And now they were going to walk out into the forecourt of Buckingham Palace in exactly the correct uniform with exactly the correct bearing, and form up with exactly the correct precision. Whitmore thought, briefly and privately, that there might not be a more defiant act available to them. When the gates opened and the detachment marched out, the crowd that had gathered on the mall saw them, and the noise changed. It was already loud. The noise of 200,000 people who'd been holding their breath for 4 years was an extraordinary thing. But when the guards marched out, the particular pitch of it shifted. Something in the crowd settled momentarily and then rose again, but differently. There was recognition in it. There was something that wanted to be gratitude but was too large for that word. Whitmore was in the second rank. He marched with the precision that training and repetition had made instinctive, with the uprightness that his body had learned to produce even when the man inside it was not upright at all, not in the moment. Because in the moment, James Whitmore was trying very hard not to cry. Not from sadness exactly, not from joy exactly, from something that encompassed both and was neither, from the sudden, vertiginous sense of the gap between where he'd been and where he now was, from the understanding, arriving all at once, that he was going to be alive after this, that the thing was over, that the next day would come, and the day after that, and he was going to be in them. He hadn't let himself think that before. For 2.5 years, he hadn't let himself think that far forward, because forward was where hope lived, and hope was a vulnerability you couldn't afford in a forward trench. He let himself think it now, just for a fraction of a second. Then he kept marching. The king appeared on the balcony. Whitmore couldn't see it directly. His position faced away from the palace and toward the crowd, but he heard it. The crowd's noise changed again, to something with a shape in it, a directedness, the sound of thousands of faces turning at once and thousands of voices rising together. The kind of sound that had once, in another country, in another life, meant incoming fire, and which his body had to consciously remind itself now meant something else. He held his position. Below the balcony, on the forecourt, the detachment stood exactly as it had been trained to stand. Above the balcony, the crowd continued its enormous, untranslatable noise. And somewhere in the middle of it, in the gap between the public spectacle above and the formed-up soldiers below, something was happening that had no official name and appeared in no order sheet, and was, for that reason, possibly the most real thing occurring on that ground. The men of the battalion were standing through it. All of them, every last one. The men who'd been at the Somme and hadn't spoken about it since. The men who woke at 3 in the morning. The men whose hands shook at sudden sounds, and who'd spent 6 weeks watching sparrows, and being curtsied at by small girls, and listening to Fenwick's commentary and polishing rifles that didn't need polishing. They were standing through the end of the thing that had made them what they were, and they were doing it with their backs straight and their buttons correct, and their faces giving nothing away. It cost them more than anyone watching could have understood. It was worth more than anyone watching could have known. Afterward, after the formation, after the crowd began to thin, after the king withdrew and the great noise settled into something more diffuse, the men came back inside. The guardroom was crowded, which it wasn't usually, people coming in from different posts, different assignments, everyone finding their way to the same space without quite deciding to. Tea materialized from somewhere. There was a bottle of something that Doyle produced from a location nobody asked about and nobody was going to ask about. For a while, nobody said much. Then Fenwick said, "So that's it then." And someone said, "That's it." "Doesn't feel like something, does it?" Fenwick continued, which was perhaps the most unexpectedly precise thing Fenwick had ever said. "Feels like the end of a word." "Or the start of one," said Jedge from his corner. "Both maybe." Harwell was by the window. Not looking out, the window faced inward, toward the forecourt, just standing near it with his mug of something that might or might not be tea. Whitmore came to stand beside him. They stood together for a while without speaking, which was one of the things experienced men learn to do, share a silence without needing to fill it, because the silence between two men who'd been through the same things was not empty. "When do we go back?" Whitmore asked eventually, meaning home, meaning to their actual lives, whatever those were now. "Demobilization," Harwell said. "Weeks, months maybe." "And until then?" Harwell looked at the forecourt through the glass. The crowd had almost gone now. A few stragglers, a few couples standing arm in arm in the November cold, a cluster of children who'd been brought to see the historic day and were now being herded homeward by adults who probably needed to sit down. "Until then we do the job," he said. "Same as always." Same as always. The world still needs someone to stand still in it. Whitmore thought about that for a while. The stove crackled. Outside, a pigeon landed on the flagstones and looked around with that specific pigeon expression of deep suspicion about everything. "Jedge will be pleased," he said. "The pigeons are back." Harwell almost smiled. "Almost. There's a photograph. Not a famous one, not in the history books. The kind of photograph that ends up in a family album and then in a box in an attic. And then, if the family is lucky, eventually in a local archive somewhere, of a small group of grenadier guards standing in the forecourt of Buckingham Palace on the afternoon of the 11th of November, 1918. They're in full ceremonial dress, the bearskin hats, the scarlet tunics, the rifles at the correct angle. Their faces give nothing away. That's the thing about the photograph that makes you look at it twice. In every other photograph from that day, and there are hundreds of them, thousands, the streets and the parks and the public spaces full of people kissing and weeping and throwing hats in the air, and generally permitting themselves every possible expression of the enormous thing they were feeling. In every other photograph, the feeling is visible. It's on every face. But not on these faces. These men are standing as they were trained to stand, precisely, formally, correctly. And yet, if you look at the photograph long enough, if you really look at it, past the formality, past the ceremony, you start to see something in it that you can't quite name. Something in the set of the shoulders, something in the line of the jaw, something that is not happiness and not grief but contains both. The way very old scars contain both the memory of the wound and the proof of survival. These men had stood through the beginning of it and the middle of it and now the end of it. They had stood between the world that was ending and the world that was starting. They had held their posts. That was all. That was everything. Edmund Harwell went back to Shropshire after demobilization, worked his father's farm, never talked about the war at dinner, but sometimes, late in the evening, he would sit outside by himself and be very still, and the family learned not to disturb him then. Thomas Jedge moved to Bristol, worked in insurance, wrote letters to his sister every week until she died in 1947, and then wrote them to her daughter. Arthur Fenwick talked for the rest of his long life, and never ran out of things to say, which was a mercy to everyone who knew him. William Oakes, the young man who stood his post at Hyde Park Corner on a July afternoon when the ground shook, became a policeman, then a chief inspector. He never mentioned the bomb incident professionally, not once, but on the anniversary of it each year he would stop on his way home from the station and stand outside the church near his house for a few minutes, for no reason he ever explained. James Whitmore raised 3 children and 8 grandchildren. He lived to 91. In the last years of his life, his grandchildren sometimes asked him what the war had been like, and he always said the same thing. It was a long time, he said, a very long time. And when they pressed him, because young people always pressed, and this was right, they should press, it was important to know, he would think for a moment and then say, "We stood our posts, all of us. Whatever the post was, wherever we were, we stood it." And then he'd look at them with the eyes of a man who'd seen November 1918 from inside it, from the particular vantage point of a young man who hadn't expected to see it at all. "And then the silence came," he'd say, "and then we came home." He'd pause. The silence was the most extraordinary thing. You have to understand that. After everything, after all of it, what undid us was the silence. Because silence meant it was over. And we hadn't let ourselves believe, not really, truly believe, that it would ever be over. He'd look out the window at whatever weather was happening. But it was, he'd say, it was over. And then, usually, he'd ask if there was any tea. Because some things, even after everything, remain the same. And that, perhaps, is the whole point.